My name is Amber Sullivan. I'm 32, and I learned something brutal at my father's 70th birthday. Respect in my family had a seating chart. They didn't just forget to set a place for me. They made a point of walking me past the main dining room, past the linen and crystal, then stopping at the edge of the terrace like it was the proper place for an embarrassment. No argument, no discussion, just a polite hand gesture and that tight smile people use when they're ashamed of you. I didn't fight it. I sat down where they wanted me, alone, within view, but not within reach, close enough to hear the laughter and far enough to be ignored. The message was clear. Stay out of the photos, stay out of the conversations, stay out of the legacy. A few minutes later, someone stepped out, looked at the empty chair across from me, and smirked like this was entertainment. "The patio is for failures," she said. I kept my face neutral, because I'd learned that reacting only feeds them. My phone vibrated once, then again, then a third time, the kind of pattern that doesn't happen unless something is on fire. I glanced at the screen and felt my stomach drop, not from fear, from timing. The situation had finally moved faster than my calendar could control. Inside, they were raising glasses. Outside, I was counting minutes. I stood up before dessert was even announced, not to make a scene, but because if I waited another 10 minutes, I wouldn't get to choose what happened next. And that's when the sound started. Low at first, then closer. Heavy enough that people began turning their heads. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. The dining room kept moving as if I didn't exist. From my seat on the resort terrace, I could see everything through the glass doors. The head table, the bright smiles, the practiced laughter that rose whenever my father, Richard Sullivan, lifted his glass. My mother, Diane Sullivan, stayed close to him, smoothing the evening the way she always did, watching who looked impressed and who needed attention. My sister, Meredith Sullivan, floated from group to group like a host, even though it wasn't her party, while my brother, Brandon Sullivan, positioned himself near Dad and talked loudly about his big year, making sure strangers heard him. I stayed outside because that was the message they wanted to send, not just to me, but to everyone else. I was allowed to be seen, not included. When a couple from my father's golf circle asked about his children, he answered without looking at me, summarizing my life in a neat line that made them nod sympathetically. Diane added a polite laugh at the end, sealing it like a joke. Meredith glanced toward the terrace as if checking that I'd heard. Brandon didn't even bother. He was already selling his next story. I kept my hands still on the table, the same control I used when someone tried to provoke me in a meeting. The difference was that here, the provocation was personal, and my father had decades of practice turning personal into tradition. My phone buzzed again, soft against my palm. I tilted the screen away from the windows and saw Grant Holloway's name. Call, now. Grant was my general counsel and head of compliance, a man who avoided urgency unless urgency was unavoidable. If he was pushing like this, something had already crossed a line. I stood, walked to the far end of the terrace, and answered with my voice low. Grant didn't waste time. A partner organization had mishandled protected files, and the situation had escalated fast enough to bring regulators into it. They wanted an immediate written response with a clear chain of responsibility, corrective steps, and signatures that proved leadership was present and accountable. If we missed the deadline window, it wouldn't stay administrative. It would become legal, public, and expensive in ways that didn't stop at money. He spoke in outcomes, not drama. Injunction risk, contract suspension, mandatory disclosure, and the kind of reputational damage that poisons future negotiations before they start. An emergency meeting was already forming with operations, security, and the executives who had been holding everything together while waiting for my decision. Grant had arranged transport because driving would waste the remaining time, and time was the one resource we couldn't replace. I listened without interrupting and built the decision tree in my head. What had to be signed, what had to be said, who had to be kept out of the room, and what could not leak before we had control. Grant finished with the only line that mattered. He needed me physically present on secure ground to sign and to direct the response. I ended the call and looked back through the glass. Inside, Richard was mid-toast again, soaking up attention. Meredith's smile was too sharp, like she could feel that my focus had shifted away from their little theater. Brandon leaned toward a man in a blazer, still pitching himself like he was the product. Diane noticed me standing and frowned, not with concern, but with annoyance, the way she did when something threatened the picture she wanted to preserve. She cracked the door just enough to ask if everything was fine, keeping her voice light for the people behind her. I told her it was work and left it there. She hesitated, then nodded once, already rehearsing how to explain my absence without admitting she'd put me outside in the first place. The door closed, and the party continued as if I were a weather problem that might pass. I returned to my chair, unlocked my phone, and typed a single message to Grant. 10 minutes. Secure the room. No outside calls. Then I sat still again, because the only thing worse than being treated like nothing was letting them see that it bothered me. A little later, the dining room kept laughing, but the resort staff stopped moving like it was an ordinary night. Plates disappeared faster. A manager in a blazer stayed near the service corridor, speaking into a radio and watching the lawn. 2 attendants shifted a couple of chairs away from the terrace doors as if they were clearing a path. It was quiet, controlled, and familiar to anyone who understood how quickly a situation could become a headline. Meredith picked up on the change immediately. She stepped outside with the same camera-ready smile she wore inside, then let it sharpen when she reached my table. She didn't sit. She hovered, making sure I felt the imbalance. She told me I should have tried harder tonight. She said the terrace made me look small, and that was on me. She said Dad had guests who mattered, and I was making him look like he had raised the wrong daughter. Her voice stayed low, but she chose words that could float back through the open door. I kept my expression flat. She wanted a reaction she could parade as proof that I was jealous, bitter, unstable. I gave her silence. When that didn't work, she leaned closer and asked what I actually did for a living. She said it was always something with work, always vague, always convenient. She made it sound like I had spent my adult life avoiding real responsibility. Brandon followed her out a moment later, drawn by the chance to perform. He planted himself where he could be seen from inside and started talking about his latest deal again, louder than necessary, dropping names and bragging about growth as if volume created value. He didn't ask me anything. He just talked, assuming I would sit there and absorb it like punishment. Through the glass, I could see Richard at the head table, laughing on cue, basking in the attention. Diane stayed close, smoothing every interaction, making sure the night looked perfect even if it wasn't. Neither of them looked toward the terrace long enough to see what was changing. My phone vibrated against my palm. I didn't check it right away. I could already feel the timeline tightening, the way it does when legal risk stops being theoretical and becomes immediate. Meredith watched my face, waiting for the crack. When she didn't get it, she switched to something colder. She reminded me that Dad valued tradition, that he respected people who knew how to network, that he built his life around appearances, and I had never learned to play along. She said I could have been useful if I had chosen a path that made sense to him. That landed in a different way. Not as pain, as clarity. In this family, competence meant nothing unless it could be displayed at dinner. I stood, not to retreat, but to end the angle she had created over me. Meredith straightened too, as if my movement proved her point. Brandon paused mid-sentence, irritated at losing his audience. I said I needed to take a call. It was the only explanation they were going to get. I walked to the far edge of the terrace where the wind carried sound across the lawn. The landscape lights were on now, and beyond them, a manager pointed toward a flat stretch of grass near a service drive. A security guard appeared where there hadn't been one before, scanning the perimeter like he had been assigned a specific job. When I finally checked my screen, Grant's message was waiting. The executive response team was assembled, the secure room was ready, and every external line had been cut to prevent leaks. They were holding until I arrived. I typed back, "On my way." Meredith and Brandon stayed behind me, watching, still convinced I would fold and come back inside to sit quietly while they praised themselves. I didn't turn to explain, because explanations were a gift they had never earned. And then, somewhere past the lawn lights, a low mechanical hum began to form, faint at first, then steady enough that a few heads inside started to tilt toward the windows. The hum deepened into a defined rhythm, and the resort stopped pretending it was just another celebration. A manager in a blazer spoke into a radio and guided guests away from the windows with practiced politeness. Outside, security took positions along the path to the lawn, not aggressive, just present, the way professionals become visible when something time-sensitive is about to happen. The aircraft came in low over the trees, lights steady, rotors cutting the air with a weight that pressed against my ribs. It didn't drop into the grass like a stunt. It aligned with a cleared landing area near the service drive and settled with precision that said the pilot had done this before. Staff held their positions, eyes tracking the skids until they touched down. Inside, conversation thinned into a murmur. People stood with glasses half raised, trying to decide whether they were allowed to stare. My father's table turned toward the terrace doors. For the first time that night, I saw confusion in Richard's posture, a detail he hadn't planned for. Meredith's smile faltered. Brandon stopped talking mid-thought. My mother's expression tightened as she calculated what this would do to the picture she had curated. Rotor wash pushed across the lawn, lifting napkins and tugging at tablecloth corners. The noise swallowed the party and replaced it with something that belonged to a different world, one where decisions were made quickly and excuses had a cost. A resort coordinator approached the dining room doors and quietly told the maitre d' that the landing had been cleared and approved, then stepped back as if the procedure mattered more than the spectacle. The staff moved with the kind of discipline you only see when liability is real. I tapped a short reply to Grant on my screen. "Keep the room sealed. Log every call." A door opened on the helicopter's side. Two people stepped out in dark coats with earpieces, scanning before they moved. They didn't look at the dining room. They looked at the perimeter, the route to me. A moment later, Grant Holloway emerged behind them, holding a slim case. Grant crossed the lawn at a fast walk, the kind that reads as calm only to people who have never had to manage crisis. His attention stayed on me, on my posture, as if he was checking whether I was ready to take control. When he reached the terrace, he kept his voice low but clear. "Ms. Sullivan," he said, formal, deliberate, the way he spoke when words might end up in a transcript. "We need you now." It wasn't a greeting, it was hierarchy. Grant opened the case and pulled out a folder, tabs already arranged. He pointed to specific sections, keeping it concise. A partner organization had mishandled protected records, and the situation had escalated fast enough to bring regulators into it. A suspension notice was ready if the response was late or incomplete. Our largest partner wanted written assurance of corrective action and leadership accountability before they froze services. Council also had a draft statement that had to be locked down before anyone else tried to control the narrative for us. He said it because the clock didn't care that my family was celebrating a birthday. I took the folder and scanned the first page, eyes moving to the sequence. Verify containment, authorize the response team, sign the compliance commitment, approve council's communication, then get on a secure call with operations and executives who were already waiting. I nodded once. Grant handed me a secure phone, the kind that didn't rely on hope. Behind the glass doors, bodies pressed closer. Richard stepped away from the head table and moved toward the terrace, his chair scraping the floor loud enough to draw eyes. Diane followed, lips parted as if she could still redirect the moment. Meredith shifted her weight, suddenly unsure. Brandon's expression drained, the performance replaced by calculation. I didn't turn to meet them yet. I stayed with the paperwork, because the fastest way to end a crisis is to treat it like a crisis, not like theater. Grant angled his body slightly, a subtle shield that communicated boundaries without making a scene. I signed where I needed to sign, initialed where counsel required it, and handed the folder back. Then I lifted my eyes toward the doors, not with anger, not with triumph, just with the steady focus of someone who had stopped asking to be invited inside. The terrace, which had been used to exile me, had turned into the place where authority was delivered to me in public. The dining room doors opened, and the party's warmth spilled onto the terrace. My father came first. Richard's face held its usual certainty, but it didn't fit the scene anymore. My mother followed, moving fast enough to look concerned while still protecting her posture. Meredith and Brandon trailed them, suddenly quieter, suddenly aware that an audience had formed behind the glass. Inside, people weren't toasting. They were watching. Champagne glasses hung midair. Conversations died in place. Behind the glass, a few guests leaned in to whisper, the kind of whisper that spreads faster than music. Meredith's earlier line about where I belonged hovered over the terrace like smoke, and now she couldn't pretend it had been harmless. Richard stepped toward my table as if he still owned the space. His eyes moved from Grant's folder to the helicopter beyond the lawn and back to me, trying to force the moment into a category he could control. He asked what this was and why my lawyer was addressing me formally. I answered with facts. I told him there was a time-sensitive compliance situation, and I had arranged transport because the decision window was closing. I kept it short, because in my family, long explanations become a sport. Grant stayed slightly in front of me, angled toward the doors. That one detail made the boundary visible. This was not a family debate. It was a professional response. My mother tried to smooth it. She suggested we move inside to talk privately, as if privacy would restore her ability to manage the story. Meredith attempted a thin laugh and implied I must be borrowing importance for the night. Brandon's instinct went straight to opportunity. He asked if I could make introductions, if my team could look at something he was working on. Richard cut that off and demanded to know who I worked for, where I had gotten access like this, why he had never been told. I let the silence sit for a beat, not for drama, for precision. Then I told him I didn't work for anyone. I ran the organization Grant represented. I was the one who signed what he carried and the one who answered when regulators asked who was accountable. The terrace went still. Even resort staff seemed to pause, not out of curiosity, out of protocol. Richard's expression shifted from disbelief into recalculation. My mother's eyes narrowed as she measured what this meant for her social circle. Meredith looked back through the glass, as if she could find an exit that didn't require facing the room she had tried to keep me out of. Grant spoke once to confirm the next step. The response team was waiting, and the secure call would begin as soon as we were seated. Richard tried to pull it back into family, asking why I never said anything, why I let them think I was struggling. His tone carried offense, as if my silence had been a personal betrayal. I gave him the plain reason. I stopped sharing when every detail became a punchline. I learned to build without witnesses. In our house, information wasn't care. It was leverage. And I got tired of handing it over. My mother flinched at that, because she recognized herself in it. Brandon, desperate to regain footing, mentioned the resort expansion he'd been bragging about all night, the project he called his big break. He said it like it would remind everyone that he mattered. That was where I decided to be specific. I told him I already knew about it, because my compliance office had flagged the proposal weeks ago. The financing structure he was chasing required disclosures he hadn't met, and the resort's ownership group had been advised to pause until the paperwork was clean. Brandon's face drained. Richard's head turned toward him sharply, hearing for the first time that the success he had been applauding might have been a performance. Meredith opened her mouth, then closed it. My mother's smile failed completely. I didn't raise my voice. I told Richard I wasn't here to negotiate my seat at his table, and I wasn't interested in becoming a story he could retell now that strangers had noticed me. I had paused on the terrace for one reason, so they would understand that tonight wasn't a misunderstanding to be fixed with better manners. Then I stepped away with Grant, leaving them on the terrace in full view of the room they had guarded from me, and I walked toward the helicopter without looking back. I didn't go back to the dining room. Grant guided me through a service corridor where the party noise thinned into radios and clipped footsteps. A resort coordinator confirmed the landing area would stay restricted until departure, then stepped aside as if procedure mattered more than curiosity. Once regulators are involved, time stops being polite. My phone lit up with missed calls and texts, including a family group thread that had never included me until the terrace turned into a stage. The shift was immediate and ugly. My mother's first message was wrapped in concern and image management, asking if we could talk somewhere quiet. My father's tone was sharper, demanding an explanation for why a lawyer was addressing me formally. Meredith tried to erase her cruelty with a bright line about being proud. Brandon sent questions that read like a sales pitch, full of introductions and opportunities, as if I had just revealed a resource he could finally use. I didn't answer any of them. Grant asked if I wanted him to intercept. I said yes. In my world, boundaries are procedures, not emotional speeches. We boarded for speed. Inside the cabin, the noise softened into a controlled thrum. Grant opened the response package, tabs already set. I reviewed the language because words matter when agencies get involved. The issue was larger than a mistake and smaller than a disaster, the kind of incident that turns into litigation if you hesitate. An immediate written response was required, signed, specific, and clean. The secure call connected, and the emergency meeting began. I kept my instructions plain: contain the exposure, document custody, isolate affected systems, notify only what policy required, and keep internal communication tight enough to survive discovery. Grant confirmed the deadline window, confirmed who would speak to whom, and confirmed what would not be said publicly. When we lifted off, the resort dropped away beneath us like a picture I no longer lived inside. My phone buzzed again. Diane asked me to come back so the guests would not talk. Richard left a voicemail that sounded like an order. He said I had made him look foolish, and I needed to fix it. Meredith offered to manage the narrative, as if the problem was pronunciation. Brandon asked if I could reassure the resort ownership group and keep his financing conversation alive. I forwarded everything to Grant and wrote one instruction for him to send back: all future communication goes through counsel. Grant asked whether I wanted exceptions for my parents. I said no, not out of spite, but because I was done confusing blood with permission. Back at our secure office, the meeting continued in person. We signed the final response, locked the statement, and set a schedule for corrective actions that would satisfy regulators and protect partners. The team moved like a machine, and I was the decision point they needed, not the family accessory my father preferred. While I worked, my family escalated. They called my assistant. They tried secondary numbers. They reached out to people they thought might know me. My assistant logged each attempt and asked for direction. I told her to block them at the front desk and record every message. If Richard or Diane wanted to speak to me, they could request a meeting through Grant during business hours. If Meredith or Brandon wanted anything, they could speak to counsel and expect nothing. Access was not a relationship. By morning, the practical fallout was already starting. The resort's advisors, now aware that regulators were involved around my organization, began reviewing every outside relationship connected to that event. Brandon's proposal, the one he had been selling all night, suddenly looked less like ambition and more like exposure. Requests for documents went out. Meetings were postponed. People in the United States do not take chances when their own liability is on the line. Later, Grant briefed me on one more complication. Meredith had posted about the party earlier, tagging the resort and attaching my last name like a decoration. In a normal week, it would have been harmless. In a week like this, when compliance was already active and eyes were already on us, it was a risk. We preserved it for the file, requested removal through the proper channel, and moved on. That night, I went home, changed clothes, and sat at my kitchen table with the city humming beyond the glass. I wasn't sad. I wasn't triumphant. I was clear. Some families teach you how to belong. Mine taught me how to leave. A few days can change the way a family says your name. Consequences arrived the way they usually do in the United States, not with screaming, but with emails, canceled meetings, and attorneys who write as if every line might be read in court. Grant kept me focused on what mattered. The resort's ownership group sent a formal notice to my father and his guests, confirming the terrace incident had been documented by staff. Their risk team wanted statements, not feelings, and the same people who once treated my father like a fixture began treating him like a liability. Richard's next invitation to sit on a local charity board quietly disappeared, replaced by a polite note about reconsidering optics. Brandon's expansion pitch stalled fast. Lenders asked for disclosures he could not produce, and the resort advisors paused all talks until their review was complete. A sponsor at his local business association pulled support after a short clip of him boasting at the dinner circulated. It did not matter that it lacked context. In rooms like that, optics become risk, and risk gets cut. Meredith tried to rewrite the night. She sent a long message about pride and embarrassment. Grant replied with one line, "All communication through counsel." When she pushed again, our office issued a written no-contact demand, clear enough that further attempts would support a restraining order if it became necessary. She stopped, not because she understood, but because she recognized a boundary backed by consequences. Richard waited longer. He called from unfamiliar numbers, then through the resort concierge. Grant offered a video meeting with terms and a short list of topics that would not be discussed. Richard refused. He wanted control more than conversation, and that told me everything I needed to know. Diane sent one last note, careful and quiet, asking if I could come to Sunday dinner so we could start fresh. I archived it. Fresh starts require accountability, and my family only practiced regret when an audience demanded it. I did not buy anything to prove a point. I did not return to deliver a speech. I removed my access, my attention, and my availability, and I let distance do what pleading never could. If there is a lesson in what happened on that terrace, it is this: people who respect you only when you are useful were never respecting you at all. Dignity is not a seat at someone else's table. It is the boundary you set when they keep trying to shrink you to fit their comfort. Thank you for listening. If this story made you think about your own boundaries, tell me where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now.